Hello, I'm Lynn Thigpen, and I've lived in Southeast Asia for over 20 years. I'd like to talk to you today about the dark side of orality. Oh my, what might that be? First, I want to look at a quote by Bill Gates, one he shared at a Harvard commencement. You know, he dropped out to become a big success, but that day he challenged a group of auspicious people. He said, humanity's greatest advances are not in its discoveries, but in how those discoveries are applied to reduce inequity. My dissertation research in Cambodia unearthed a number of inequities, and I hope the people who listen to this presentation will begin to address them intentionally. I've been working with oral learners for more than a decade and a half, but I began doctoral studies a few years ago to understand them better. I wanted to understand how they really learn. I knew they used more than oral means to learn, so the term oral learner wasn't quite true. So first off, what should I call them? Here in Cambodia, we don't live in a primary oral environment with no written language or educational system. No, the folks I work with are just adults who have had little opportunity to learn. So I prefer to call them more correctly adults with limited formal education, ALFE for short. I thought I was embarking on a cognitive journey to learn more, but what I encountered was surprising. It was emotional. The issues were not what I thought they were. The villain of the story was not who I thought either. And why should you care about this topic today? Because these learners are all around you. Let me tell you just one story. The first day of interviews was a day I will never forget. I went to a familiar place. I listened to familiar people. I'd been teaching people how to story, but I never heard their deepest woes and the many obstacles they had faced and conquered. Shame on me. That day I heard what it was like to be uneducated in a place where school is available. I heard what it was like to be poor and give up the right to education because your family needed you to work. One lady in her 30s told me she went to school, but she simply couldn't get it. She couldn't learn to read to this day. She said to me, Rian Ot Joel, which means the study would just not go into her brain. Her younger sister sat next to her, and what she did next introduced me to a whole new world. I knew these kind of things happened in Asia, but younger sister started shaming big sister. She said, I don't know why she can't get it. I don't know why she just doesn't try harder. I think she's stupid. These words were said in public to big sister's face. I knew this thing happened, but I just hadn't felt it before. The weight of the words were just too much for this Westerner. Younger sister lathered on words of shame, and by the time she finished, we were all drowning in it. But big sister just sat there licking her wounds and drinking in the poison. It wasn't the way I imagined research going. I looked at this precious child of God and realized she was not stupid. And even though I'm not a special education teacher, it dawned on me that she probably suffered from a learning disability, most likely dyslexia. So I held her hand and I looked at her and I explained another kind of learning style, one that's just a little bit different, but millions of people all over the world have it. I did not know the words for it in Khmer, I still don't, but I had to explain the concept of mixing up letters. I told her not to worry. Lots of people have this, and they're not stupid. I touched her arm and told her she was not langong, which is stupid, or ignorant, that she had worth. She was precious. She cried and I cried. She said, I've got goosebumps. I'm so happy to hear this news. And that was not the way I imagined research going either. Not everybody I interviewed was in the same situation. Some people didn't study because their lives intersected with war. Others had limited education because they had to stop studying and work to help their families. Is this situation with adults with limited formal education out of the norm, or is it widespread? Well, the International Orality Network estimates, get this, 4 billion people over the age of 15, not a little bit of the population, but 2/3 of the world's population are oral communicators, people who cannot or prefer not to read. Let that sink in. So how many of us are literate, highly proficient readers, those who've studied at advanced levels? There was a study conducted in America, in the United States. They had 6 levels of literacy from 0 to 5. The 5s were the people who could read and analyze and use reading to learn. The kinds of things we ask people to do when we ask them to do inductive Bible study. So who are the 5s and how many are there? Only 2% of the adult population in the United States functioned at the highest level of literacy. 2%. Let that one sink in. 4 billion oral learners, 2/3 of the world's population. The people who are listening to this most likely are among the tiny minority of highly proficient readers. We're pushing reading when the majority of the world would rather not embrace it. Please don't get me wrong, reading is a great skill to have, and some of the people I interviewed did go on to learn to read and write, but some did not. But we highly literate people are not the norm in the world. The other side of this coin was poverty. Many of my friends also lived in tremendous poverty. Most of the time when we think about poverty, we think about numbers, about people making less than $1 a day. But there's a fuller measure of poverty taking into consideration health, education, standard of living. The MPI, the Multidimensional Poverty Index. The MPI says that a family is deprived if no member of the family has more than 5 years of schooling. They're destitute if no member has more than 1 year of schooling. But even that doesn't begin to describe what it feels like to live in poverty. Poverty is so much more than these indicators. Researchers talk about the missing dimensions of poverty, the things that are of value to poor people. What might those dimensions be, and why should we care? In the 1990s, the World Bank surveyed over 60,000 financially poor people throughout the developing world and how they described poverty. They described it as more innately social and psychological. What did they really care about? They cared about things like empowerment, dignity, hope. These were valued as much as livelihood, education, and health. People cared about their mental well-being, their physical safety, and whether they could walk around their communities without shame. My national friends were caught in a vicious cycle, many of them. Of course, not everyone who cannot read is poor, but most of my friends were. This condition of lack, this poverty, caused a lack of formal education, resulting in a lack of honor or dignity in the face of the community, a feeling of shame, known as the poverty-shame nexus. Lack of material goods, lack of formal education, lack of opportunity, lack of understanding, lack of honor, but no lack of shame. In primary oral societies with no written languages or reading material, lack of formal schooling is not associated with shame or failure to learn. But in societies with the expectation that their kids will be educated, a lack of formal schooling or illiteracy can be a source of great shame. We've all experienced shame and embarrassment, but these adults had a lethal dose of shame, and they were suffocating, paralyzed, and hopeless. They were drowning in the toxic variety. According to Walker, shame is one of the most pernicious of emotions. They had shame inside, shame outside, shame everywhere they turned. They had limited education, but unlimited shame. And no one talks about this much yet in orality circles. Shame is at the core of poverty, and I never thought about it that way. I always wanted to fix the financial aspects, and I never considered the emotional ones. Shame leads to Withdrawal, self-loathing, despair, depression, thoughts of suicide. I never imagined these to be a part of an oral learner's life. I was busy telling Bible stories and I never got to the core issues. Included in this mess was what is known as the Conundrum of Failure. Many adult dyslexics who struggle with learning to read feel this spiral of failure. One educator called it feeling incomprehensibly flawed, having a sense of global inadequacy. Combine a conundrum of failure with a cycle of lack, and you have a perfect storm of epic proportions. And this storm is going on all around you, and I was totally unaware of it. Shakespeare referred to one's good name as the jewel of the soul. Of course, he was talking about one's reputation, but what about your face, what you present in the community, your name, your dignity? Isn't that a valuable jewel too? Well, how does all this work in the church setting? How is the jewel of the soul played out in church? Well, I met one man I will call Samnang. That means lucky in Khmer. He was lucky for some reasons and not so lucky for others. He was a guy in his 20s who worked in agriculture. He tried to go to school just like many other people I interviewed, but he couldn't read at all either. He explained also that he couldn't get it. Rian Aunt Joel. Again, the learning just wouldn't enter his mind. He too probably had a learning disability, so we had a very familiar conversation about dyslexia. But what he said next about the church has affected me to this day. He said, when I go to church and I see the hymns on PowerPoint, even in remote rural locations, the songs on the screen, and I watch people read from the Bible, I just want to die. I want to kill myself because I can't read like other people can. Such shame. And in church, we're people of a book. So how are we going to deal with this? Our master was exposed to the worst kind of shame so that we might enjoy honor and connection with him. How can we let such a thing go on? Which leads me to the villain in this story. Can you guess who it might be? Who's at fault? Is it the Alfie? Of course not. Why do these learners feel shame? Despite their strengths, they feel shame because they lack something. They lack formal education, they lack literacy. And our modern education applauds learner-centered strategies. But what about being learner-centered with non-readers? That's not even on the list. Most of the time programs will shout, we'll teach you to read. But what if adults just want to learn something else? Here's the inequity. Can you sniff it out, the culprit here? We don't provide learning in the ways that Alfie prefer. We shove reading on folks to the exclusion of learning instead of providing opportunities for people to learn without reading. Shame on us. In a study of school-induced shame, educators found that the shame of poor school performance diminishes feelings of competence and distorts self-image. And learning strengths and ways of knowing are dismissed and controlled or unrecognized. Why do we do this? In a world full of tolerance, why do we still operate this way? It's not totally accurate to assume that people with low levels of education are deprived some way. It may be more accurate to assume they have different types of learning, more procedural, pragmatic, or sensory. Wheaton said, emphasizing success at school as a criterion for success in life can be debilitating for those whose interests and aptitudes lie elsewhere. So all this creates a lack of material goods, lack of formal education, lack of honor and dignity, then a lack of connection with others. The shamed person withdraws from a community, feels disconnected and disgraced. So what's the antidote for this kind of toxic shame? The day I first met this kind of toxic shame was the day I literally felt the Father delivering an antidote. Formal schooling and literacy studies can't be the solution. That's where the problem started. That's where the loss of faith began. But there is an old concept that runs through an ancient text. What does someone who feels disgrace need? They need grace. Shaming wounds and isolates, but gracing can heal. Grace means to confer honor or dignity on. It's been described as unbroken, uninterrupted, unearned, accepting relationship by cloud. And the prime place for this kind of redemptive gracing is the faith community, where people connect with the community of believers and with the Savior who is well acquainted with shame. Those working in development have long advised dignity-enhancing strategies. How can we give dignity to our Alfie friends? Love banishes shame, one writer wrote. God's love just leapt from my heart toward those people that I interviewed. His love seemed to ooze out toward them to heal their hurts, to want to rescue them and help them to continue learning in the ways they prefer to learn. Grace and love would prescribe restoring the shame, honoring their strengths, welcoming in them in the community of faith, and giving them learning in the ways they prefer. What are those ways? That's a talk for another day. That is a long talk, so talk to me about that later. Remember Bill Gates' comment at the beginning of this presentation? He went on to say after that comment, reducing inequity is the highest human achievement. I don't necessarily agree totally with this statement, but I do believe our Master, while on earth, was involved in giving dignity to the shamed. He loved, he connected, he honored, he gave grace. It's not fair that these precious people have limited education. It's not fair that they are ashamed because of it. It's not fair that they don't feel welcome at church. And it's not fair that obstacles stand in their way of learning, especially learning about their faith. Limited formal education doesn't have to limit God's people. In Acts, they noticed that Peter and John were uneducated and untrained men, but they recognized that they had been with Jesus. We can be like Jesus and include the uneducated and the untrained. We can walk with them, connect with them, and teach them. Today I've exposed to you the dark side of orality, the great deal of shame in the crevices of the lives of people. But I want to ask you, what are you going to do about it in your ministries? What will you do for dyslexics who might want to study God's Word? How can you help non-readers in the church? How can our sanctuaries be non-reader friendly? What can you do to restore the shamed? And how will you supply the antidotes our Alfie friends need? If you need advice, email me. I'm happy to help. Thank you for listening.